Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this lunch briefing with UC Hanhimäki on the theme Déja-vu, all over again, the new American president and the world. My name is Christine Lutringer. I'm the executive director of the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy here at the Graduate Institute, and I have the pleasure to moderate the talk today. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker, UC Hanhimäki, who is Professor of International History and Politics at the Geneva Graduate Institute. He's a faculty member since 2000 and was previously a lecturer at the London School of Economics. From 2002 to 2003, he was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and he is the recipient of the 2002 Bernath Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. He was elected Finland Distinguished Professor in 2006. His main research interests include American foreign policy, transatlantic relations, and the international history of the Cold War. His latest book is Pax Transatlantica, America and Europe in the post-Cold War era. I'd like to mention also a few recent papers that he published, one in Foreign Affairs in May this year titled The End of Nordic Neutrality, What Finland and Sweden Bring to NATO, and another paper titled Transatlantic Relations and the Ukraine War, published in 2023 in Cold War History. In this lunch briefing, Professor Hanhimäki will explore the implications of Donald Trump's election for the rest of the world, for multilateral cooperations, and for the ongoing conflicts. The key question is, will there be dramatic changes or will continuity prevail? The format of this lunch briefing is the following. We have roughly an hour for the event. We will start with the presentation by Professor Hanhimäki, about 30 minutes, and we will devote the rest of the session to the discussion with the audience. If there are many questions, we will be able to extend the lunch briefing until 1:45. So welcome to you all here at the Maison de la Paix and also online. And I'd like to mention that online attendees may ask their questions by typing them in the Q&A chat on WebEx. So thank you very much, UC, for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Christine. And thank you all for coming. It's always a pleasure to come to the podium and pretend that you know something about something. And I think in this case, nobody knows really all that much except what just happened. But in terms of what I'm going to try to do here today is to think about, indeed, the implications of what just happened, which is that the United States had elected its 47th president. The name of that is known to everybody. It's Donald J. Trump. And he ran on a platform or on a slogan called, he referred commonly as MAGA, Make America Great Again. And as I happened to be in Washington just 2 weeks ago, I visited the Museum of American History. Looking at different elections, I found this very interesting looking lapels that those promoting certain candidates always wear in American elections. 1980, Let's Make America Great Again. Reagan Bush, the winning ticket then, and of course the winning ticket, the exact same slogan 24 years later as it was 8 years ago as well. So the point and the provocative title, Déja-vu, all over again, basically refers to the basic question. Everything always is changing, but how much and what is going to change as a consequence of what everybody thinks is a very, very consequential election. So, I'm going to try to be, as a Finn, I'm always accused of sunny optimism about everything. That is a joke, and you have to tune yourself to my jokes today. But I think less catastrophic, less pessimistic, less end of the worldish as many of those I speak to these days, and I try to sort of. Perhaps that will be part of the provocation that I want to make today. But let's just start with this, which is, yes, indeed, what just happened, which is what just happened is what some people are calling a landslide, but of course it's not a landslide. What just happened in the United States is a significant shift in terms of who is in the White House, who controls the US Senate, and most likely who's going to control the House of Representatives as well. It's all going to be red, and not the communist type. It's all going to be red in the Republican sense. That what is already clear is that the presidency, Senate, and so forth belong to Republicans, and most likely, as I said, also the House of Representatives. Now, margins are, and they have been in the recent American elections, very small. If we talk about landslide, the most recent landslide, in fact, was in the 1980s. In 1984, when Ronald Reagan totally demolished his opposition, Walter Mondale, by winning 49 of the 50 states and way over 60% of the popular vote. So that's a landslide. Richard Nixon had a similar landslide in 1972, Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Those were landslides. This is not a landslide. This is a shift, and as you can, but because, of course, America's very peculiar electoral system and so forth, it looks like something really fundamentally transformed just last week when Americans went to vote. And what happened is that those so-called swing states shifted red as opposed to blue. 7 of them, all of them. Now, what didn't happen, what was expected, and what also happened is that Donald Trump, for the first time in 3 elections, actually won the popular vote. So those are important facts about the election, and this, the Democrats are going over and over and over, what went wrong and what did we do, and so forth. Republicans saying this is a major transformation of everything, the world just shifted, the ground just shifted, and so forth. Yeah, but at the same time, well, we also know that fewer people went to vote this year than 4 years ago, which was contrary to expectations. In some ways, the turnout is going to be slightly less, not slightly, about 4% less than it was 4 years ago. Donald Trump is getting a little bit more votes in the popular vote than he did last year. But what really happened was that the Democrats did not go and vote in the same way as they had 4 years ago. So where Joe Biden got 81 million votes, Kamala Harris is going to get roughly 10 million less. And that's the significant transformation that has taken place. But it also means that this is hardly going to be a permanent transformation in American politics. Nothing really in American politics ever is permanent, and we see ground shifting constantly and so forth. I should also warn, whatever I say today, most of it is not going to happen. It's not going to be the way I predict. Punditry is very affirmative about we know. If you go back and look at the predictions in 2020, the predictions in 2016 after the election, you'll find some really interesting things about Donald Trump will never set foot in Washington ever again after 2020. In 2016, everything was going to collapse and so forth. So, we have to always have a little bit of a grain of salt in the traditional way. So, well, let me move. So, undeniably so, MAGA, Trump 2.0. Remember, many of you will remember 2016. This was one of the cartoons from then. 2016, of course, was an exceptional year in that Donald Trump won in the aftermath of the Brexit vote also in Great Britain, which was a big surprise. The UK chose to leave the European Union. And then a few months later, November, surprise, nobody expected Donald Trump to win, and off he bounced out of the box and was going to be the next president of the United States. And it became rather chaotic for a long time, as you may all remember. And this time it seems that everybody leaves. Well, Donald Trump is here. He's been festering for about 4 years. He is ready to really, fire everybody in the world, including he's going to be ready to heat up our climate to the boiling point that is otherwise known as weather in Florida. But he's clearly, the expectation is at least that he's on a warpath. He's on a vengeance. He's going to take out and hurt everybody who ever hurt him or perceived hurt him. He's going to wreak havoc to everything that some people here hold dear: multilateralism, NATO, etc., etc. And okay, maybe. However, and then I was going to focus on the rest. Few slides just talking about through a couple of the big issues that have been discussed and people tend to worry about the most. So I'm not going to go back to worrying about what the Democrats are going to do next. That's their business. But what is going to happen potentially in the coming months and years regarding some of the big items on the agenda: Russia-Ukraine war, NATO's future. Within that, the Middle East. Obviously, is there going to be peace in those two places or extended war, and so forth? China, the promised trade war, renewal of the trade war with China, extensive tariffs and so forth, and then multilateralism in general. As East Geneva, should we just all pack up and go home? And the last guy turn off the lights because multilateralism now is dead. It's not, I don't think, and so that's going to be the sunny Finnish optimism coming out of this, I hope. But in terms of Russia-Ukraine, of course, Donald Trump famously has promised that there's going to be peace in 24 hours. It seems like he doesn't say when the 24 hours is going to start, so I'm sure he's right. That in the end, depending when you start counting those 24 hours, that's when guns are going to undoubtedly silence. I think it's very likely. I think my point would be that yes, but is it? And Trump is going to be bring in a peculiar kind of transactional element into this process with his special relationship with nobody fully understands with Vladimir Putin, with Mr. Orbán in Hungary, potential mediator in all of this. So the specifics will indeed unfold, I think, in the coming months. They may even unfold before January 20th, to a large extent, before Trump officially takes office. My other point would be that this probably something along those lines was likely to happen anyway. Whether Harris or Trump was going to win. I think in terms of the U.S. and its commitment to Ukraine, and the sort of also for Europeans and their commitment to Ukraine, you could see, witness over the past year or so, a gradual fatigue that is, of course, not in the interest of the Ukrainians. But there is clearly the sort of sense that there's not going to be a sort of, that the end of the war in Ukraine is not going to be Ukraine liberated from all Russian forces. If that's ever going to happen, it's going to take a very, very long time. That the commitment for that is not necessarily there on any side in the alliance supporting Ukraine. So a diplomatic solution of some form or another was going to be necessary. It's not going to happen on Joe Biden's watch because of the particular political sort of corner he has painted himself in when it comes down to Ukraine. So that was never going to happen. But of course, whether Harris and others, it was very, very likely that's going to happen. So I think that's something that, yes, there will be negotiations, there will be some kind of deals to be made and will be made on Ukraine. What they exactly will be like, I don't know. But I don't think also they're going to be a total sellout of Ukraine. So then they may be some kind of a combination of security guarantees, whether actual NATO membership or something else it remains to be seen. The other point connected, of course, has to do with NATO and the United States, which is a perennial topic since 2016, since all those comments about, yes, it's obsolete, it's not useful, Americans are footing the bill, and so forth. Some of that inevitably will continue, some of the undermining of that will continue, but I think the dynamic is quite clear that this is not a new thing, and it's not necessarily peculiarly a Trump thing to complain about the Europeans just sitting happily under the umbrella. This is something we can go back to the 1960s and we can find the rhetoric, and whether it's a Democrat or Republican in the White House, that same argument more or less forcefully has been made over the years. What I think Trump, in part, managed to do is push the Europeans to spend a little bit, to approach that magic 2% target of defense spending. But in the end, what really pushed the Europeans, I would say, in this graph is clear. It's not Trump, it's Ukraine. And after 2022, as you can see, I think, from the graph, is the number of European countries spending over 2% has skyrocketed. Well, skyrocketed, it's doubled since the start of the war. And now about 2/3 of them do. Now, it is in the nature of Donald Trump that that's not enough. Certainly it's not enough. They need to spend more. And maybe the ceiling will be raised to 2.5% or 3% or something like that, just to keep it going. Because it is also, and this is what really matters, I think, for the likes of Donald Trump, it is a cool thing to do at home to show yourself a tough president abroad, to bully the sissy Europeans around. To get them, make them act like, they're tough too. So you have to give them a little push. But whether or not this will ever amount to an actual plan of action it's pointless to be in NATO at all. I doubt, simply because it is giving up power and influence. And a few leaders like to do that. And I think in the case of Donald Trump, I don't think he is quite ready for that kind of a momentous step. To give up leadership, to give up influence in that regard. Because with NATO, the United States has a great deal of influence. It has a great deal of clout in Europe. And it is only through NATO, ultimately, that the United States can sort of wield influence in the Ukraine peace process as well. So, quick, because I don't have too much time to do this, try to do this as quick as possible. The Middle East, I think there is, I think, and here the word uncertainty is certainly, this is something I think is a general description of what is to come, which is uncertainty, unpredictability. Trump, of course, thrives on this. Let's keep them all guessing. Now we're guessing who is he going to nominate to be Secretary of this or Secretary of that. Is Marco Rubio really going to be Secretary of State? We'll find out probably today or tomorrow. And that will have then lead to other kinds of speculations. But this is the sort of the modus operandi of the transactional president that Donald Trump is. And I think it applies certainly to Ukraine. And NATO, I think it equally applies to the Middle East. There is, of course, it's very clear that Donald Trump will not abandon Israel. That is certainly one clear thing. It's very clear that Benjamin Netanyahu was very happy with the end result of the US election. But sadly, that also gives Donald Trump a lot of clout when it comes down to influencing the process or Israeli policies in going forward in the coming months. And what does he want? Does he want to see further escalation in terms of the conflict, or does he want to be what he calls himself to be, which is a peacemaker? Somebody who's going to make a deal, use the art of the deal and create an agreement that will, of course, be very bad for the Palestinians. But a deal nevertheless. And so I think that probably is part of the story. Now, there is an added twist to the story that came out last week, which is that it turns out, and this is almost, from some Hollywood conspiracy movie, or I don't know. That's what it feels like sometimes, the alleged Iranian plot to kill Trump. And, is that going to have any impact on actual policy? This sense that we have to get back at the Iranians for this. Probably. Some impact, but it's not going to be ultimately the determining factor, it seems to me. And so the Middle East, I think, uncertainty with a clear bias is probably the modus operandi going forward. I should add that, had, again, Kamala Harris won, would things be that different vis-a-vis the Middle East? The United States, under the Biden administration, was not going to abandon Israel at any moment. They tried to be a bit even-handed in some ways. But that clearly, certainly in terms of the election, was unhelpful. In a few votes certainly were lost, either with the Arab American populations in Michigan or with the Jewish American populations in Florida and elsewhere. Certainly this had the doubt that a future Harris administration is going to be pro-Palestinian somehow, which is a fantasy, but a kind of a useful sort of marginal vote mover in US elections. So that certainly was contrary to the fact that in the end, neither Biden nor Harris after him was either going to abandon Israel or have some magical way of approaching a miraculous two-state solution that will be a peaceful one and that with all parties in the conflict are going to accept. Hardly a realistic scenario, but something that politically can domestically be kind of a fun thing to play with, to show that, you vote for her, things are going to go to hell in a handbasket very, very, very quickly. So, then the third point I wanted to look at very quickly again is China, which is, I think, something where, in fact, the continuity aspect of American policy is probably going more clear than almost anywhere else. Ever since the Obama administration, it's clear that China and the United States have been on a very competitive path. Trump, 2016, Trump 1.0, of course, it was all about, raising tariffs on Chinese goods, and there were selected raises of tariffs in that regard. This time around, tariffs have become, as Trump mentioned, it's the most beautiful word in the dictionary. Well, anybody who studied the 1930s and the Great Depression and its impact on the rest of the world, of the impact of the so-called Smoot-Hawley tariffs of 40% on goods coming into the United States and what that did for global trade, would probably find that it's not all that beautiful. But it is, and again, there's nothing new in anything that Trump does in a broad sense. Whether it's tariffs, whether it's immigration, which has been an issue in the United States since the late 19th century. This is not new stuff. The package and the packaging is very different. And it's more fit to the social media age in many ways. But the messages themselves are not all that different. Or at least bits and pieces can be found. America First wasn't invented, of course, by Donald Trump. So, what's going to happen with this? Of course, Trump wants to, it's a wonderful cartoon, take the tariffs and shoot at the Chinese panda. 60% is the number that he tended to float there, with only 20% for the others, but China's going to get special treatment. The trouble with all this is that if we believe any economist, and I of course believe anything my economist colleagues tell me about the future of the economy, nobody ever got that wrong. And so this time will be no different in that sense. Any prediction, of course, it's going to pan out exactly the way that we believe. But my sense is that, again, these threats of tariffs, much as in the first Trump administration, these threats of tariffs tend to be tools of pressuring the other side to concessions. It's part of the process of making the deal happen. 60%, I don't think so, because there is selective tariffs, no question about that. But if the impact of those tariffs is going to eat into Donald Trump's domestic base because of its consequences and so forth, then and I think many of his advisors will at one point or another point to this, then there's going to be a much more sort of pick and choose kind of approach to tariffs. You pick on those tariffs that you can make the most of in the public domain. In terms of how does it play out on the social media page? If you raise certain tariffs on luxury goods or something like that, if you put one of the things 500% on Mexico's car imports from Mexico. Okay, well that might indeed go well with some of Trump's domestic political base. It's not going to travel, so its economic impact will take some time, but it's going to be popular. So as long as tariffs seem popular, as long as enough people believe in the United States that it is indeed the most beautiful bird in the English language, yes, why not? Because the impact ultimately then, will it be felt in the next 4 years or not? Most likely not. So Trump, in this sense, will not be totally unrestrained, but there will be some sort of clear-cut the temptation to use tariffs as a publicity tool and as a policy tool is very, very tempting. Okay. Now, last sort of substantial point I had is about, well, what does all this mean to multilateralism in a big sense, international Geneva, and the many organizations here. Should we all pack up and go home? Well, of course not. That yes, there's going to be some impact. It's because, as they say, America first it is philosophically opposed. America comes first, and then the rest come after. Sorry about doing that. I get so excited. To the idea that there's some outside force outside of the 50 states that can exercise any kind of control on the United States. That is what America First is all about. Not all about, but that's one of the aspects of America First. So that is something that, but that is, the other point about that is it's not exactly new. If you think about previous administrations, if you think about them accepting accountability from the rest of the world, no. That hasn't exactly been the American position on many issues. It's been multilateralism sort of a la carte. Now, it's true, for example, that the first Trump administration took the United States away or distanced itself from a number of agreements and institutions, the Paris Climate Agreements, Iran nuclear deal, Human Rights Council, the WTO, the WHO, and so forth. However, does that make the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, exceptional in its attitude towards multilateral organizations, so forth? Well, Jimmy Carter, as many of you may remember, took the United States out of the International Labour Organization for about the period of 3 years. Ronald Reagan, of course, was no fan of the UN. He withdrew the United States from UNESCO. Bill Clinton from the UN Industrial Development Organization. George W. Bush slightly more muscular man from the Kyoto Protocol and the Rome Statute of the ICC. So it's not like being the United States is somehow now suddenly totally turning a page. I'm not saying there's not going to be a difference. I think there is a difference. Trump clearly sees the instrumental value of all this for drumming up support for his policies. That the outside world is threatening the American way of life. That's what MAGA is all about. It's making America great again before you got invaded and controlled by the forces of globalization. But at the same time, we have to remember that America has always been first for an American president. And it's not that there's been great reluctance of allowing any kind of outside control, whether it's certainly the U.S. domestic political process. The UN didn't get to go and observe whether elections were free and fair in the United States, right? So there's certainly resistance to that. But there's also clear-cut sort of resistance to allowing any international organization to have sway over American policy. The US is in the UN and has stayed in the UN for the last 80 years, to a large extent because it's one of the P5. And of course, it has been the major donor of funds for the UN, and hence it's been able to direct resources to directions it wishes, and American policy that benefit American policy. It's not because of altruism. And of course, I'm not saying there are no altruists and humanitarians among the American electorate or policymaking community, but it's not the thing that drives policy, that allows money to be spent necessarily. So my very last point is a broader point about the United States and the world in a sort of general sense. Many of you who've followed the United States and discussions about the United States and the world over the last few decades, if not longer, know that one of the big discussion points has always been American decline. America is in decline, others are in the rise, America no longer number one, and so on and so forth. That's been the thing, and it seems that Trump's election, certainly the way many of us non-Americans here, I guess, feel about the United States today and what it stands for and so forth is a bit different than a generation ago. And I think Trump is not alone, of course, responsible for that trend, but certainly what has changed, I would say since the end of the Cold War, since the early 1990s, is that some of those ideas that made the United States sort of symbolically a leader or a symbol of the free world, a leader of the free world, that has gradually begun to evaporate. They really, and if you ask somebody what is the free world today, they will probably pause and wonder how to answer that question, as opposed to if you ask somebody in the 1980s, what's the free world and who's the leader of it? I think, so things have changed in that sense. And, there's part of that is, there's a joke, it's not, of course, it's part of everything that America has done, right? So there's all that, there's all the military interventions and so forth that have not increased the love and the respect that the United States enjoys around the world today, as opposed to perhaps in some happier, long foregone era. But the other thing is that part of this is also the success in which the spread of democratic politics and so forth have had, in part because of United States policies over the long post-World War II era. But what it means is that the United States isn't all that exceptional today. The United States is not necessarily the leader of the free world. The United States is, there's freedom in Belgium and there's freedom in the United States. And what's the difference? Goes the old joke. But what it means that the United States has been on its way to becoming an increasingly normal country in that sense, at least in the people's imagination. And yet, at the same time, of course, the United States enjoys an economy that is, the economist recently announced, the envy of the world. It is the biggest economy in the world. It has moved beyond the high inflation era faster than most other economies in the world. The growth rates are higher than in Europe, for example, and so forth. This was not a winning message in the election, as you noticed, that this is perhaps due to some of the policies enacted in the last few years, but it's not a winning message. But at the same time, it's a reality. And so that, of course, is something that Donald Trump enjoys as he's going to take office, enjoys this position of the United States as still on top of the league tables of the world when it comes down to the economy, when it comes down to the military, and so forth. Now, what will he do with that? So my prediction, to sum up, is that unpredictability, incoherence, and yet the appearance of being very aggressive and decisive are probably the easiest ways of getting around it. I do not have a clear-cut prescription because I don't want to be quoted on this is going to happen and that's for sure, because I have no idea. And ultimately, of course, most pundits should have a little bit more humility when they start announcing certainty and so forth. So I'm going to stop there. I think I may have gone a few minutes over, and I will thank you very much, and hopefully you have a fun discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Jussi, for unpacking recent and also ongoing developments, which is quite a challenge, and also for outlining what you see as the basis on which the US will probably base its external relations. So before giving the chance to the audience in the room and online to ask questions, I'd like to come back to your point on multilateralism. And in fact, you have recalled the kind of developments that occurred also at other presidencies, during other presidencies, but Trump still was quite aggressive, and seen from Geneva and from the work done here among multilateral organizations, I think there is big concern about what could happen in the second term. In the first term, his administration left the Human Rights Council. He withdrew from the World Health Organization in the midst of the pandemic, and so on. So maybe my question would be, beyond the actual decisions, there was also, and there will be, the criticisms of the multilateral system as a whole. So I think among the labels that Trump used previously, it was biased, unreliable, or unfit, and contrary to Americans' interests as the international system as a whole. So my question would be, would you see the risk of these kinds of criticisms of also undermine the legitimacy of multilateral organizations, and therefore also the support of other countries, big or small countries, to the international system? And how would you see the implications for the Geneva-based organizations?
Okay, so that's a lot to unpack, but a couple of points. Number one is, of course, Trump is part of a bigger phenomenon. I think that's one thing we have to recognize. It's part of a bigger phenomenon that is maybe most easily described as those who are sort of 21st century nationalists versus 21st century globalists, if you will, or multilateralists versus nationalists, or something along those lines. There is this divide. You find this divide in most European countries in internal politics. Every country has its, well, call it a Trumpist party, but it's not really, it's probably predates Donald Trump's appearance from that elevator to, you know, if you think about Switzerland has its original nationalist party, of course, which continues to be the biggest party in this country, but you know, we have the Marie Le Pens and others, the Finnish version of that, which is the True Finns, and you know, Brexit was part of this broader phenomenon of sort of resistance to external control, I guess. But I think that is an ongoing struggle that we see in certainly across what I like to call the transatlantic political space. That you see this back and forth struggle. And you know, if you look at the last 3 US elections, you can see 2016 is in a sense an anti-globalist triumph, although you know, it was very, very close. You see in 2020 a sort of reaction to that. Counter-reaction with all the craziness of Trump 1.0, and now you see the reaction of what seems to have been a fairly unsuccessful, unsatisfactory performance by the Biden administration and in bringing America back, as it were. So, in the broadest, and this is a bit of a cop, I can't sort of predict how this organization or that is going to have the hardest time. Although if I was in WHO, I was sort of, well, déjà vu, yeah. So I would be a bit concerned about and you know about and questions of human rights, of course, always will. But I think you did my point. Broader point is you see this criticism all across the board, and it is. Sort of complemented by the other point, which is that, well, is multilateralism really about the United States? And if it's about the United States, then we are in trouble. Because if it's about the red and blue states, the differences, minor differences, and I think the calculation is that what sort of pushed this election around was ultimately about 30,000-40,000 votes in those swing states that went the wrong way, depending, you know, if you're in the blue category, and the right way if you're in the red one. I have a sense that most of you are in the blue, but you know, if that's what multilateralism depends upon, then yeah, we should all really go home and, you know, last guy turn off the lights and who cares? It's not going to work. And there's been a lot of this discussion. You know, the Europeans, for example, simply complaining about the United States being difficult is not a policy. Wake up, spend more, invest more. Whether it's in NATO or whether it's in the UN and the different organizations or whatnot. That's the real answer. It's not about waiting for the right political result to come from the United States of America. That's really not the long-term strategy in this regard. It's not a healthy strategy, because it clearly, it's not multilateral. That's the sort of multilateralism in the shadow of kind of a unilateral reality, and that's probably not the real thing then anymore, is it?
Thank you. So let me first open the room here at the Maison de la Paix, and then we'll take some online questions as well. So I see one question here, second there, and third here. So if you please introduce yourselves briefly before you're asking your question.
Hello, my name is Ruslan. I'm a MINT candidate in my second year in the Conflict, Peace and Security program. Thank you so much for the insightful discussion. I would like to ask your opinion, Professor Hanhimäki, I hope I pronounce it correctly, regarding two questions. So the first point would be, what do you think about this notion of unchecked power that's often being prescribed to Trump in his now second presidency? Do you think that it's truly possible for a democracy like the United States to have a president with unchecked power, even given the threat of lawsuits following his decisions? And the second question relates to, more broadly, the role of the big tech in this election, especially the most famous richest man in the world who participated directly in the election campaign and funded the election campaign. What I find truly interesting, if we park for a moment multilateralism and look at international affairs more broadly, is how will Musk's access and ability to shape government policy will affect international affairs more broadly, given that it's a private sector actor that has ambition to reach space and settle on Mars. Truly an international and global affair in my regard. Thank you so much.
Shall we take a second question?
Yeah.
I saw, yes, the second question here.
Professor, thank you very much for a fascinating talk, which I expected. I had a question about an area that you didn't touch on most of your talk, which is China, the other big player in the room. How do you expect U.S. relations with China to evolve under Trump?
And yeah, I would suggest to take one more and then Akim for the second round.
Thank you. Yeah, Alan Dick from the alumni of HEI. Follow up on your question. What's going to happen to Taiwan, knowing that Trump says, I will be the president with no war? Then the other point is, if you could comment on this, my feeling is that the Republicans, they need Donald Trump to get the presidency, but they hell fear him. He's unpredictable. We have seen how he acted with his former vice president. And my feeling is that the Republicans will use him as long as they can, but then they will get rid of him by saying he's too old, health, or whatever. And Vance is positioning himself to be the next president.
Okay. So let me try to do this in order. So the idea of unchecked power it's all over CNN, isn't it? And it seems very spooky and scary and so forth. There's no question that Donald Trump feels he has a lot of scores to settle from the last few years, and you know, the lawsuits against him either have to be abandoned or be put on hold indeterminately. I think he senses that he has all the power in the world in terms of the courts, the Supreme, and then going down to appointing different judges. And that is a bit scary. Now, in the end, the other point is that since everybody's discussing this so much, there's so much concern about it, that the so-called resistance, if you wish to call it that, is already underway. Every lawyer in the United States is ready for a bonanza of some sort in terms of lawsuits and others. The legal challenge is going to emerge on any number of policy issues. I think immigration, which is the first thing that seems to be on the agenda, which is going to start rounding up people and sending them back. The sheer cost of that is magnificently high, and B, you cannot do most of that and bypass all the legal processes involved in it. So that in itself is probably going to sort of create all kinds of checks and balances, I think. So yes, I mean, I understand what you're asking, that, you know, there is, especially now if the House of Representatives also is red, of course there seems that there's this idea, this unchecked power and so on. There is a concentration of power, and the America's system allows for the use of executive orders and things like that quite a lot. But unchecked power, no, that is unlikely. And in part, if I just speak to your question about Republicans and Trump, there's a couple of things that are going to come evident, I think, in the years to come. One is that Trump is an old man in a hurry, And what's his biggest hurry is, I think, get revenge, I think, avenge some of those things that happened. I don't see him as a man who thinks greatly about the future of his children and grandchildren and what kind of America they are living. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe every impression I have is wrong, and he's not the self-centered individual. I could be, but I think he is, and because of that, that's going to be, and the actual policy around him, much of that will evolve in ways that he has no interest in surveying and so forth. It's not necessarily comforting news for anybody, but that's the reality, and it's going to lead. I think what is happening, not just yet, but certainly after January 20th, the next election is starting. The next presidential cycle is starting, and the Republicans, they want to keep the presidency, of course, after Donald Trump. Whether it's Vance or somebody else that will be the eventual candidate in all of that is something else. But Trump is going to be, not tomorrow, not in January of 2025, but in the course of the next couple of years, he's going to increasingly fade and increasingly become a kind of a lame duck in terms of his actual individual influence and power. And that's just how the calendar works, both his own personal calendar in terms of life expectancy and so forth. And we saw this with Joe Biden recently. And so that's what's also going to create another element of unpredictability in all of this, but also perhaps allow space for those, not only those who are non-Republican, but within the Republican Party to oppose some of his policies, to delay them perhaps in some way or another, and create some of those unexpected today perhaps checks and balances and roadblocks along the way of mass deportation and concentration camps and whatever else we are reading about going to happen tomorrow these days. So that's that. In terms of, if I come back to the other point you made about the big tech and Elon Musk. So Elon Musk clearly saw an opportunity here to ingratiate himself with somebody he's been critical of in the past, to show and to gain influence in government, possibly, I don't know, big government contracts and so forth. It is not, I think, if one thing I would say about the Elon Musk-Donald Trump relationship is that I don't see any long-term future in that relationship, because of any number of reasons, but Elon Musk clearly is not in this necessarily for high tariffs and rounding up immigrants and so forth. He's in this for markets, business. And, what is he famous for? He's famous for Tesla, the electric car. And so Donald Trump's environmental agenda, this is a way in which the Musk, undoubtedly will bring the sort of market force argument into the environmental debate, which seems rather grim today, of course, when we look at Donald Trump and his wonderful environmental agenda and what have you. But again, we can see that some perhaps internal type of transformation. There may be a total blow-up between the two at some point in the next 6 months to a year, and we know, and so forth. But that's. But I think certainly under Trump, the influence and the role of private business is going to be elevated simply because his background and where some of the likely nominees for different positions are going to come from. Now the last point, China and Taiwan, I think we can sort of talk about those to some extent together. And I tried to address, I think there's no question there's going to be some tariffs going China's way. Maybe not 60%, maybe not for everything, but yes, I mean that's something. I think there's going to be, in fact, the continuity element in United States-China policy is quite clear. Perhaps a little more aggressive. If you have Marco Rubio, he's famous as Secretary of State, who's famous for making a case, sort of the anti-China case, quite forcefully when he tried to run for president in 2016. All of those. It's clear that there's going to be that China is the main if not enemy, the main competition in the international arena, whether it's in the international economy, whether it has to do with the US economy itself and so forth. There's going to be something there. It is also a relationship that is quite transactional. In many ways, tariffs are the ultimate, transactional policy tool, of course, that Donald Trump has. So I think that's where tensions are. I doubt that there will be a major change regarding Taiwan, at least not in the immediate future. I just have the sneaking suspicions that they're not really planning a full-scale invasion of Taiwan in Beijing anytime soon, and I don't think that's actually ever been the great master plan. I may be wrong. I may be a Chinese agent, you don't know. But I have serious doubts about that because of the disruptive impact it's going to have. I remember all these articles after 2022, Taiwan, Ukraine, to do the same thing. Is it or is it not? Yeah, well, it's not. Right? So I don't see any serious big impact on that. Taiwan also, for any number of reasons, is quite important as for the United States in terms of microprocessors or whatever they do. So that also the shield over Taiwan, I don't think is going to be lifted under Trump, and so I think the Sino-American relationship is going to be the most important in many ways in bilateral terms in the world, but it has been like that for some time now. The U.S. shift away from Europe to the Pacific, pivoting to Asia is an old Obama term. It's, yes, that's a gradual evolution is clearly there, but so I don't see a massive thing, because in any trade conflict, in any trade war, both sides have something to win and something to lose, and so the Chinese probably are going to somehow accommodate Trump going forward as well.
Thank you. Akim, you had a question, and then I have a question online, and I see two hands there.
Thank you, Jussi. Thank you very much, and also by indicating how important it is to study history in a time when there is so much waves around exaggerations which travel so fast on social media. So thank you to put the election into a much broader historical framework. My question is about the nomination yesterday of Ali Shafik as a new UN ambassador in New York. And as her first announcement, she said that she would work in the UN by the motto of peace through strength leadership on the global stage. Now, you have 180 diplomatic missions in this town who will be in one way or the other preparing themselves for running different types of multilateral engagement in Geneva over the next 4 years. As a historian, what would you recommend them to do?
Let me take the online question, which is about the effect of the Trump 2.0 on the BRICS dynamic. And then we had two questions there. I think, yeah, gentleman there and two ladies there. Sorry.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My question is, do you think the MAGA wing of the Republican Party is here to stay? As you remember, in the previous Trump administration, Steve Bannon, after a year, was out, and later on, John Bolton was in, and it started to act more and more like the typical conservative Republican administrations. What do you think is going to happen this time? He already sent out a tweet. He said he's not going to invite Mike Pompeo or Nikki Haley, people like that. So what do you think about the future of the Republican Party? Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I wanted to ask if you think he's going to implement Project 2025. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a great talk. Really enjoyed it. I just wanted to ask that with the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and so on, or America First, Trump's policy, that had very negative impacts climate-wise and otherwise to a development in the global South. What do you think that dynamic would be now? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I don't know how to answer your question. I think it depends. You said 180 ambassadors. Obviously, they represent 180 sets of different interests. Multilateralism isn't about everybody agreeing on X, Y, and Z. So I think what is it depends a lot on which one of these ambassadors we are thinking about. I think what will be common to them is trying to figure out the role that the United States in the new administration, how long will it take for there to be all these diplomatic appointments that took forever last time around, and I think most U.S. embassies remained understaffed throughout the Trump administration. But how long will it take for there actually to be the new personnel that have some kind of a connection to not necessarily the White House, but to the presidency and so forth. So that will be the one of the number one questions. In terms of, and I can only really give you sort of general points. The other general point I wanted to say is that if we learned something in the previous Trump administration about foreign policy, how it's made, and so forth, it is a sort of a caricature version of the president that wants to be his own Secretary of State, which is most presidents, in fact, have been like that. But Trump is sort of exaggerated and a caricature-like version of that. So whoever is Secretary of State, in the end, and I think one can say maybe some positive things about Mr. Rubio, but he's not going to be the strong player, at least not in the beginning when it comes down to making U.S. foreign policy. And so I think the point about that too, in terms of multilateralism, in terms of having connections to the United States, is that there is probably going to be some form of a two-tier system in which, yes, there are the official embassies and so forth, but if policy change is advocated or needed or hoped for, not going to happen necessarily through those embassies and through those official representatives, but rather in this sort of closed circle type mentality of the Trump administration. I think whoever is the UN ambassador of the United States actually isn't a greatest post to have in the Trump administration, because your role is going to be minimal. I think that's one of the reasons why Nikki Haley left quite early. Other was because he wanted to run for president, but that's another story. So that's one. The other question, Milan, you asked about the MAGA wing. Of course it's here to stay, but it's going to change. MAGA for Trump, I think, was a slogan, useful tool. It was a brand. Mamma mia, did he make a lot of money on those T-shirts and hats and so forth. So it's that. I don't think it's a personal philosophy in a broad sense. It's not. You can't write. There's not a Mein Kampf or something like that. It's not that kind of a strong, straightforward ideology or anything like that. It represents a wing, and it represents a wing that has, for some reason, thinking in terms of U.S. politics, Trump's personality is the key to understanding what's happened. For some reason, I can't fully understand, people love him. Millions of people love him. And why they do is a mystery to me personally. But but it's a fact. Now, once he is not in the picture, I think the so-called MAGA and the MAGA wing is going to not dissolve totally, but there's going to be all kinds of infighting and all kinds of different directions, all kinds of jockeying for positions and advantage and so forth. In other words, a normal political process. And that's very likely to happen sooner than I think we today may be anticipating. Trump on BRICS is a very good question. BRICS, of course, is not a particularly cohesive alliance or anything, and I think it's sort of tailor-made for Trump to, in his transactional manner, to at least he would ideally see that that's okay. I can pull this guy against that guy, and I can offer him this and this country that, and this is how I'm gonna keep making America at the center of all of that. In a sort of, if you look for historical, as Achim was saying, historical precedents, in the same way that, say, the early 1970s, the Nixon administration, they thought, aha, we're going to play China against the Soviet Union, and, we're going to make them act in a certain kind of way. It only works so far, but I think that's the sort of thing that is going to, I think, undermine the cohesiveness or the direction towards cohesiveness, if such a direction exists, which I'm very doubtful of within the BRICS. That Trump's going to certainly try to insert himself and disrupt those cooperations. Is there anything else? I think in terms of climate, it doesn't look great, right? I think it's like in multilateralism in general, the point that I made earlier, it can't be all about the United States. And the Paris agreements can't be all about the United States. The climate doesn't belong to the United States. And so I understand the concern and so forth, but it should not be the death, the tolls aren't, ringing in that sense. And I think, again, politically, economically, talked about Elon Musk earlier and electric vehicles and so forth. So yeah, I mean, there are ways in which policies that in line with Paris agreements or the Kyoto protocols and so forth can and have been pushed within the United States for economic reasons. If indeed electric cars are profitable and declining price and so forth, that's what's going to happen. So it's probably, I think again here the objection in the United States often is that the multilateralism, the international agreements and organizations are seen as an impediment on America's national sovereignty. But if that argument can be turned around and said, well, actually, these things are economic; they're very profitable. This is true capitalism, at the core. Someone like Elon Musk is the richest man in the world, etc. It's a different kind of conversation. So I think that's where one sort of has to go. The Project 2025, some of it will definitely be implemented. I think it's, despite all the denials, I mean, that was. As much as Donald Trump ever reads anything, I'm sure he read some of it and agrees with many of the arguments and so forth. But he's not concerned with detail. And I think that's what, because that's where the staff is for that. And he's more concerned about image. The Project 2025 was not a good image in this summer because it's proclaimed all these things, and it was sort of handing the Democrats a leaflet that they can use against him. So of course he denied it. But yeah, I mean, there's policies there that definitely will be will come out in actual fact next year.
Thank you. Is there any last question? Yeah, I see one here and one there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for putting that all in a historical context. But I was wondering if you could also, or in showing how this is all part of larger trends in U.S. Foreign policy, but I was wondering if you could speak as well to the shock factor and how, even if perhaps this isn't a sea change in American policy, how the perception of a sea change globally could still play out, per se.
Okay.
Hi. My question is regarding the way he has conducted himself as a presidential candidate, both in 2016 and in 2024. The way he bullied everybody, the way he insulted everybody, and what is going to happen to the American society as a result of that, because it seems that all of that was accepted by the people that wanted to vote for him, and apparently there is a division now between men and women. Now they're saying women belong back in the kitchen and your bodies belong to us, and all of that. What do you think is going to happen to the American society, and how is that going to affect the next elections and politics in itself?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so it's sort of in some ways connected. I mean, in terms of the shock factor, and I mentioned quickly when I was talking about soft power of the United States. So clearly, I mean, what's happened here, what happened already in 2016, and what was sort of mitigated by the results of 2020 in the outside world, especially, I guess, in Europe, but also in some other parts of the world, is the shock of this sort of what seems to be hyper-nationalist kind of agenda about very muscular, very sort of transactional, very unprincipled, if you will, very short-termist kind of agenda. And it is something that I think, yes, should be always of concern. It is not the first election that's created some kind of a shock impact in the outside world, although we always remember the thing that just happened much more than the one that happened, I don't know, 12, 20, 50 years ago. Of course, that's in the past, right? And so past is another country, and we don't need to look there. But there's been maybe partial answer is that certainly in Europe, and looking at sort of writing about transatlantic relations, this concern about the United States going rogue, going alone, leaving us in the dark, pulling away the umbrella, all those concerns have been there for a very, very long time. During the Vietnam War, Europeans were terrified that the American troops would be pulled from Europe and sent to Vietnam. Somewhere, but that in the end it didn't change all that much. There's been, I mentioned, the constant barrage from the White House. You have to spend more. You have to spend more. You have to spend more. And so, none of this is new. But I think in some ways, because it's not new, what's also interesting seems to me, certainly in Europe, the sort of complacency about it. Often. We talk a lot, we say, oh God, shock, shock, shock. But, it's, in the end, the action that has come only in very few moments. One of those, the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's clearly shifted certain priorities across Europe, including my own country. I mean, neutral forever until tomorrow, when we suddenly want to be in NATO because something happened. So, it requires something like that. I think what's happened in the shock is that, yes, now everybody's wondering, can America's commitments be trusted? And I think that's the real concern, and I'm not, and that's going to be a concern going forward. And I think we will find out there are some commitments that probably will be broken, having to do with the climate agreement, for example. But I doubt with NATO completely, but even there some change will be. And I think this is going to change policies that the fact that those countries that rely on the United States will have to rethink a little bit on how much they can rely on the United States. Because, you know, even if Trump passes and so forth, you know, there'll be other moments like this. The United States policy is not static. It's not always going to be focused on certain, supporting certain agreements or certain treaties and so forth. And they made the other, so that's part. Personal conduct of Donald Trump is abhorrent. I don't think that's been one of his big cards. That's how he gains the spotlight. And I guess, I don't know the man, I don't want to know the man, but I think he knows that. And that's part of the reason why we see such crazy rhetoric. You know, they're eating dogs and all that rubbish that you heard during the election. It's not that he necessarily believes that, you know, all immigrants are coming there and eating everybody's pets, but, you know, if there's a chance that this will resonate in the social media space, and I think you have to give him credit for understanding, for his age, quite well. I think about my own parents, quite well how these things work. Wow. And how you can use them to your own advantage, and how you don't have to tell the truth. And all that is very, very unfortunate. I totally agree with you. I would take some issue, but I'm not as desperately thinking that now suddenly everything is changed and everything, and moving back to the kitchen and so. I don't think that's quite where we are. I think there's certainly some elements. Now, there are some supporters of Donald Trump that see this as the moment, well, now everything goes. You know, the Proud Boys of this world or whatever groups there are that think, wow, well, hey, he won, so now we can do whatever we want, and we can insult whoever we want, and there'll be no consequences from this. But I think in the end, the majority of those 70+ million Americans that voted for Donald Trump didn't vote for that. They voted for the fact that there might be lower taxes. They voted for the fact that there's going to be some action on what they fear is this evolving immigration crisis. They figured maybe he's going to bring down prices of food. They didn't vote, you know, the idea that this was some kind of totally an election that revolved entirely around identity issues, I think it's a false understanding of what actually happened there. I'm not saying it's absent, by no means saying that, but that ultimately what made the difference is probably in large part the dissatisfaction of the situation economically and so forth, that gave an opening for all for Donald Trump and the many Republicans to make their case. And they made a fairly coherent case compared to the other side, at least.
Okay, thank you so much, Jussi, for sharing your analysis about all this, and thank you very much for these great discussions and for answering all those questions. Thanks to all of you who joined us today for the lunch briefing, and I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon.